20 men in frozen leather stood on a porch in 50-mile-an-hour winds. They didn't knock to rob the place. They knocked because they were dying. Inside sat a 60-year-old widow who had stopped caring if she lived or died 6 months ago. When she opened that heavy oak door, she didn't see a notorious biker gang. She just saw snow, mud, and a mess she'd have to clean up. But you don't do a favor for the Hells Angels without consequences. Wind tore at the aluminum siding of the farmhouse, a persistent metallic shriek that had been going on for 6 hours. Inside, Ruth sat at the Formica kitchen table, peeling a potato she wasn't going to eat. It was mid-November in the Dakota Badlands, and the sky outside the window was a bruised, suffocating gray. The snow wasn't falling. It was firing sideways, erasing the fence line, the barn, and the county road completely. Ruth dragged the peeler down the potato. Scrape. The skin curled and dropped onto newspaper. She stared at it. Since Arthur's heart gave out in July, the house had felt too large, echoing with the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the mantel clock. She wasn't consumed by weeping. She was just deeply, profoundly tired. Grief, she found, didn't make you noble. It made you irritable. It made you neglect the laundry. The radio on the counter crackled beneath a layer of static. The local forecaster had been sounding increasingly frantic since noon. A freak blizzard, whiteout conditions, temperatures plunging to 10 below zero, not factoring in the wind chill. Ruth tossed the peeled potato into a bowl of cold water. She didn't care about the storm. The pantry was full of canned soup. The wood stove was stocked. If the power went out, she would wrap herself in Arthur's heavy wool hunting blankets and sleep until it came back on. If she didn't wake up, well, that was an outcome she was too exhausted to fear. Then she heard it. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the wind shaking the corrugated roof of the tractor shed. But the pitch was wrong. It was a mechanical guttural growl, a heavy vibration that rattled the teacups in the china cabinet. Ruth frowned, her brow creasing into deep papery lines. She stood, her knees popping in the quiet kitchen, and walked to the front window. She wiped the condensation from the glass with the heel of her hand. Nothing but a wall of white. The roaring grew louder, then sputtered. It sounded like engines drowning. One choked off entirely with a backfire that sounded like a gunshot. Then another, and another. The heavy thumping vibrations died, swallowed by the howling wind. Idiots, Ruth thought, a flash of genuine annoyance cutting through her apathy. Some damn fools got caught on the interstate and thought the county road was a shortcut. She didn't move to get her coat. She stood by the window, feeling the icy draft seeping through the old weather stripping. Let them stay in their trucks. The plows would find them in the morning. She wasn't running a motel. Then came the crunch of boots on the porch. Heavy, dragging steps. Not one person. Many. The wooden planks groaned in protest. A fist slammed against the heavy oak of her front door. It wasn't a polite tap. It was the desperate hammering strike of a man losing feeling in his extremities. The door visibly shook in its frame. Ruth's chest tightened, a dull, rusted ache behind her ribs. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away. She was a 60-year-old woman alone. She should have reached for Arthur's shotgun, kept unloaded in the hall closet. She thought about it. The image of pulling the heavy barrel down, finding the shells, loading it with arthritic fingers. It felt like too much work. The hammering came again. "Open up, hey, please!" The voice was muffled, shredded by the wind, but the panic in it was undeniable. Ruth exhaled, a long, weary breath that smelled faintly of the stale black coffee she'd been drinking all morning. She walked to the door. She didn't ask who it was. She flipped the deadbolt and turned the brass knob, throwing her shoulder against the wood as the wind immediately tried to rip it from its hinges. The door flew inward. Snow blasted into the hallway, instantly dusting the faded floral runner in white. Standing on her porch was a nightmare of leather and ice. They were massive men, blocking out what little light remained of the afternoon. Their faces were raw, windburned to a violent shade of purple, framed by thick beards completely caked in rime ice. They wore heavy leather jackets, stiff and frozen shut, plastered with snow. On the back of the closest man's jacket, beneath a crust of white, a grinning winged skull stared back at her. The Hell's Angels. There were at least a dozen of them clustered on the narrow porch, and she could see the dark shapes of more staggering up the driveway through the whiteout, leaving behind a haphazard graveyard of heavy motorcycles tipped over in the snowdrifts. The man at the front, a giant with a scar pulling down the corner of his left eye, pushed one massive frozen glove against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. His lips were blue. His teeth were chattering so hard Ruth could hear them clicking. "Lady," he forced out, his voice a jagged rasp. We're dying out here." Ruth stared at him. She looked past him to the men huddled together, shivering violently, some leaning on each other just to stay upright. They looked like monsters. They looked like violence incarnate. But looking at the blue lips of the giant in front of her, Ruth didn't feel terror. She felt a sharp, stabbing annoyance at the snow melting onto her hardwood floor. "Don't just stand there letting the heat out," Ruth snapped, her voice dry as dead leaves. "Get inside before you freeze to my porch." They poured in like a retreating army. 20 men. The sheer mass of them made the hallway feel like a closet. They stumbled over the threshold, bringing the storm in with them. The smell hit Ruth instantly, a potent, overwhelming stench of wet, dirty leather, gasoline exhaust, cheap tobacco, and the sharp, metallic tang of pure adrenaline turning to relief. "Shut the door!" Ruth barked over the howling wind. The giant with the scar turned and shoved the oak door closed, leaning his entire body weight against it until the latch clicked. The sudden silencing of the wind left a ringing in Ruth's ears. The hallway was filled with the sound of ragged, wet breathing and the heavy thud of frozen boots shifting on the floorboards. "Boots off!" Ruth commanded, pointing a crooked finger at the floor. "I'm not spending tomorrow scrubbing Dakota mud out of this rug. Take them off. Leave them by the radiator." The men froze. Several of them exchanged glances. They were hardcore bikers, 1%ers who made their living dealing in intimidation. And here was a woman who barely cleared 5'2", wearing a faded cardigan over a stained house dress, ordering them around like misbehaving school children. The giant with the scar let out a short, barking laugh that turned into a wet cough. "You heard the lady," he rasped, his voice still vibrating with cold. "Boots off." It was a pathetic, clumsy process. Their hands were too numb to work the thick laces. Men who routinely brawled in parking lots were leaning against her floral wallpaper, swearing softly as they fumbled with frozen leather. Ruth didn't stay to watch. She turned her back on 20 members of the Hell's Angels and walked into the kitchen. She turned the tap on, filling the largest aluminum stockpot she owned. The pipes groaned. She set it on the stove and cranked the gas burner to high. Water hissed against the cast iron grate, sending up a quick, violent plume of steam that smelled faintly of rust. She began opening cabinets, pulling down every mug, glass, and heavy ceramic bowl she could find. They began filtering into the living room and kitchen. Without their boots, walking in damp socks, they looked slightly ridiculous. They were too large for the furniture. A heavily tattooed man with a braided beard tried to sit on a fragile wooden dining chair, and the joints shrieked in protest. He stood back up, looking guilty, and opted for the floor instead. Soon, 20 men were sitting shoulder to shoulder against the baseboards of her living room, their knees pulled to their chests, shivering. The heat from the baseboard radiators was already causing their leather cuts to thaw, filling the room with the damp, heavy scent of wet animals. The giant with the scar walked into the kitchen. He had removed his leather jacket, revealing a thick flannel shirt that clung to his broad chest. The cold had leached the color from his skin, leaving him looking sickly and gray beneath his tattoos. "I'm Garrett," he said. He didn't offer his hand. He was holding them under his armpits, trying to force warmth back into his fingers. "Ruth," she said, not looking at him. She was tearing open packets of instant coffee and dumping them into the motley collection of mugs. Where were you fools going in this? Run to Sturgis, Garrett mumbled. Off season. Business. Forecast said we had a window. Forecast was a liar. Anyone with eyes and a barometer could tell you what the sky was doing, Ruth muttered. She poured boiling water into the mugs. The dark, bitter smell of cheap coffee instantly fought the smell of wet leather. Take these in there. Pass them around. The sugar is on the table, no milk. It went bad Tuesday. Garrett took 2 mugs, his large hands wrapping around the hot ceramic like lifelines. He looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. You ain't scared of us, lady? Ruth paused, the heavy kettle hovering over a chipped mug. She looked up at Garrett. She saw the prison ink on his knuckles. She saw the cold calculation in his eyes that was beginning to thaw along with his body. My husband died in July, Ruth said flatly. The bank is taking this house in January. My knees ache when it rains, and I don't sleep past 3 in the morning anymore. She set the kettle down with a dull clank. You boys want to murder me in my sleep? You'd be doing me a favor. Now take the coffee before it gets cold. Garrett stared at her for a long, silent moment. The corner of his mouth twitched. He nodded once, slowly, and carried the mugs into the living room. Ruth went to the hall closet. She pulled out the heavy wool blankets Arthur used to take hunting. They still smelled like him. Hops, No. 9 solvent, and Old Spice. It was a smell that usually made her chest seize up, but today she just felt numb to it. She dragged the pile into the living room and dropped them in the center of the floor. Share, she said. She watched as a man with a swastika tattooed on his neck carefully draped a plaid blanket over the shoulders of a younger, thinner biker who was shaking so hard his teeth clicked against his coffee mug. It was a strange, disjointed image. Brutal men acting with quiet, careful tenderness. Ruth turned off the main overhead light, leaving only the warm, yellow glow of the table lamps. The shadows stretched across the room, softening the hard edges of the men on her floor. They were quiet. The only sounds were the howling of the wind outside, the clinking of ceramic, and the heavy collective breathing of men who had just cheated death. Ruth retreated to the kitchen. She sat in her chair, the one opposite Arthur's empty spot. She looked at the peeled potato sitting in the bowl of cold water. She wasn't a hero. She hadn't saved them out of the goodness of her heart. She had opened the door because the noise was bothering her, and now she was stuck with them. She sighed, pulled a paring knife from the block, and reached for an onion. If they were going to be here all night, she might as well make soup. At 8 p.m., the lights flickered, hummed violently for 3 seconds, and died. The sudden darkness was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The low hum of the refrigerator ceased. The blower on the oil furnace spun down with a dying groan. In the sudden quiet inside the house, the roar of the blizzard outside seemed to double in volume, slamming into the walls like a physical weight. From the living room, a low murmur of voices rose in the dark. Leather rustled. "Nobody panic!" Garrett's voice boomed, calm and gravelly, cutting through the dark. "Everybody stay put. Don't go breaking the ladies' lamps." Ruth struck a match in the kitchen. The flare illuminated her tired face for a second before she touched it to the wick of an old kerosene lantern she kept on the counter. She adjusted the glass chimney, the yellow flame sputtering and then catching, casting long, jumping shadows against the floral wallpaper. She walked to the archway of the living room, holding the lantern high. 20 pairs of eyes caught the light, gleaming in the gloom. The temperature in the house was already dropping. With the wind chill outside sitting at -20, the drafty farmhouse would be a freezer within hours without the furnace. "Furnace is electric start," Ruth said into the silence. "No power, no heat. There's a wood stove in the den." She led the way. The men shuffled after her, a slow, limping procession of giants wrapped in floral afghans and plaid hunting blankets. The den was at the center of the house, a smaller room lined with Arthur's dusty bookshelves and his battered leather armchair. In the corner sat a large cast-iron wood stove. "Wood's on the back porch," Ruth said, setting the lantern on a side table. 4 of the younger bikers, moving stiffly, volunteered without being asked. They opened the back door, letting in a swirl of blinding snow, and hauled in armfuls of split oak. Garrett took over the stove. He moved with a practiced efficiency, arranging kindling and newspaper, striking a match. Within minutes, a fire was roaring behind the iron door. The metal began to ping and tick as it expanded. The smell of wood smoke filled the room, sharp, familiar, and deeply comforting. The men crowded around it, desperate for the radiating heat. They sat on the rug, leaning against the walls. A tall biker with a shaved head and a long braided goatee, a man someone had called Dutch, moved toward the center of the room. He was exhausted, rubbing his face with a dirty hand. He eyed the battered leather armchair sitting empty near the bookshelves. It looked incredibly inviting compared to the hard floor. He took a step toward it and turned to lower himself down. "Don't." Ruth's voice cracked through the room like a whip. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice glass. Dutch froze, half squatting. He looked at her, confused. "What?" "Not that chair," Ruth said. Her hands were clutched together in front of her stomach, the knuckles bone white. The apathy that had blanketed her all day had suddenly vanished, replaced by a raw, vibrating anger that took her by surprise. It was Arthur's chair. The indents on the armrests were from his elbows. The faint grease stain on the headrest was from his hair. It was the chair he had died in. Dutch stood up slowly. He looked at the old woman. He was a man who had put people in the hospital for looking at him wrong in a bar. He outweighed her by 150 pounds. "Sorry, ma'am," Dutch muttered, taking a step back and sinking onto the floor beside the bookshelves. The tension in the room was thick, heavier than the wood smoke. Garrett watched Ruth from his spot by the stove. He didn't say anything, just gave a slow, barely perceptible nod of understanding. The night dragged on. It was a strange, surreal vigil. 20 bikers and a widow, trapped in a 10 by 10 room. Ruth brought in the pot of beef and potato soup she had cobbled together from cans in her pantry. She handed out bowls and spoons. They ate in near silence. The only sounds were the scraping of spoons against ceramic, the crackle of the fire, and the relentless assault of the wind. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was in low, gravelly tones. They talked about the cold. They talked about the bikes buried in the yard, wondering if the engine blocks would crack. They didn't talk about who they were or what they did. Inside this room, under the yellow light of the kerosene lantern, the patches on their jackets didn't matter. They were just freezing animals trying to survive until dawn. Ruth sat on a hard wooden stool near the doorway. She dozed fitfully, her chin dropping to her chest, only to jerk awake when a log shifted in the stove. Sometime around 4 a.m., the wind began to die down. The metallic shrieking against the siding faded to a dull, rhythmic thumping, and then, slowly, to silence. When dawn broke, it was weak and gray, filtering through the frosted windows. Ruth woke up stiff and aching. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The men were asleep, tangled in a massive pile of limbs and wool blankets, snoring loudly. Garrett was awake. He was sitting by the stove, poking the embers with an iron rod. He looked at Ruth as she stood up and rubbed her lower back. "Storms broke," Garrett said quietly. Ruth nodded. She walked to the window. The world outside was buried. The snowdrifts were waist-high, pristine, and blindingly white. The motorcycles in the driveway were just strange, humped mounds under the snow. By 8 a.m., the county plows rumbled past on the main road, the flashing amber lights cutting through the morning gloom. The men woke up slowly, groaning, their bodies protesting the cold and the hard floor. They began the arduous process of putting their frozen gear back on. The leather was stiff, resisting their movements. Nobody said much. The shared intimacy of the long, dark night was evaporating with the morning light. They were becoming the Hell's Angels again, pulling on their death heads, their armor. They filed out the front door, stepping onto the shoveled porch. They began digging out their bikes with their bare hands, kicking the kickstarters, the engine sputtering and coughing before finally roaring to life, shattering the quiet of the morning. Garrett was the last to leave. He stood in the hallway, his jacket zipped up tight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, damp $100 bill. He placed it on the small entryway table. "For the soup," Garrett said. "And the wood." Ruth looked at the money. A spike of irritation flared in her chest. She didn't want their money. She hadn't done it for money. Taking it felt like making it a transaction, erasing the fact that they had been nothing more than humans in her house. "Keep it," Ruth said, her voice hard. "Buy better weather gear." Garrett looked at the bill, then at her. He didn't take it back. "We owe you, Ruth. We don't forget. Just close the door tight on your way out. The latch sticks." Garrett nodded. He stepped out into the freezing air and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The latch clicked. Ruth stood in the hallway. The house was empty again. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. The smell of wet leather and wood smoke lingered, a ghost in the air. She walked into the den. The blankets were folded neatly in a pile. The fire was dead. She looked at Arthur's chair. It was empty. She felt the heavy, soaked wool blanket of grief settle back onto her shoulders. She was alone again. She walked into the kitchen to start doing the dishes. Winter broke its teeth on the Dakota Plains sometime in late April. The waist-high drifts didn't melt so much as they surrendered, turning the front 40 acres into a soup of gray mud and submerged, rotting corn stalks. Ruth hated the spring. It was loud. The gutters dripped endlessly. The floorboards, warped by the damp, groaned under her slippers. And the smells returned. The frozen, sterile air of January was gone, replaced by the damp, metallic odor of the thawing earth and the faint, sour smell of mold creeping up the basement stairs. She stood at the kitchen sink, running hot water over a sponge. The water pressure was terrible. The well pump had been failing since October, making a rhythmic, grinding thump every time she turned a tap. She scrubbed at a coffee stain on the Formica counter, pressing her thumb into the sponge until her knuckles ached. It was Tuesday. Mail day. Ruth dried her hands on a dish towel that had worn thin in the center. She didn't put on her boots. She just slipped her feet into Arthur's oversized rubber galoshes and walked out the front door. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of wet gravel and manure from the Miller farm 3 miles down the county road. The walk to the end of the driveway took longer than it used to. The mud sucked at the rubber boots, pulling her heels up. Her left knee, the one with the missing cartilage, ground like a rusty hinge with every step. The metal mailbox was dented on the side where a snowplow had clipped it 3 years ago. When she pulled the latch, the hinge screamed. Inside sat a single thick envelope. It wasn't a bill. Bills came in flimsy envelopes with plastic windows. This envelope was heavy, cream-colored, and bore the embossed logo of First Dakota National. Ruth didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what it felt like. It felt like Arthur's hospital bills. It felt like the funeral costs. It felt like the second mortgage they'd taken out to pay for the first two. She walked back to the house, the mud splattering against the calves of her faded jeans. She left the galoshes on the porch, walked into the kitchen, and dropped the envelope onto the table. She made coffee. Cheap grounds, scooped directly from a tin can. She poured it black and sat down. She picked up a butter knife and slit the top of the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. She pulled out the document. 3 pages stapled in the top left corner. The legal jargon was dense, swimming across the page in tight black ink. But the numbers and the dates were clear enough. Notice of foreclosure. Date of eviction, June 15th. Ruth traced the edge of the paper with her thumb. She didn't cry. Crying required energy, a well of emotion that had dried up and cracked long ago. Instead, she felt a hollow, spreading numbness in her stomach. 32 years in this house. She knew which step on the staircase to skip so it wouldn't wake Arthur. She knew exactly how many seconds to hold the flush valve on the toilet so it wouldn't run. The history of her life was scuffed into the baseboards and stained into the wallpaper, and a man in a suit 50 miles away had just wiped it out with a signature. She looked at the calendar tacked to the corkboard next to the refrigerator. May 10th. She had just over a month to pack up a life and figure out where a 60-year-old widow with bad knees and no savings goes to die. She folded the letter, creasing it sharply with her thumbnail, and shoved it back into the envelope. She put it in the drawer with the spare batteries and the twist ties. The silence of the house pressed against her eardrums. It was different from the silence of the blizzard. The blizzard had been an assault. This silence was an absence. It was the sound of a house waiting to be empty. Ruth stood up. Her joints popped. She walked into the den and looked at Arthur's chair. "Well, old man," she said to the empty leather. Her voice was raspy, dry. "Looks like we're moving." She didn't know where to start. You don't pack up a life. You dismantle it. She went to the basement and dragged up 3 flattened, dusty cardboard boxes that used to hold mason jars. She dropped them in the center of the living room floor. Dust motes danced in the pale spring sunlight filtering through the window. She taped the bottom of the first box. The ripping sound of the packing tape was violently loud. She looked around the room, the ceramic knickknacks on the mantel, the framed photos of people who didn't visit anymore, the heavy, ugly brass floor lamp she had always hated. She picked up the lamp and threw it directly into the trash can. It clattered against the plastic. "One down," she muttered. June arrived with a suffocating, dusty heat. The mud dried into deep, ankle-twisting ruts. The grass in the front yard turned brittle and yellow, crunching underfoot like crushed glass. The house was half empty, echoing and hollow. The living room was a maze of taped-up cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and stale packing tape. Ruth was sitting on the floor in the hallway, sorting through a box of Arthur's old tools. Wrench, screwdriver. A pair of pliers rusted shut. She tossed the pliers into a garbage bag. Her hands were gray with grime, her fingernails packed with grease. A car door slammed outside. Ruth didn't jump. She just stopped moving. She listened to the crunch of gravel under dress shoes. A sharp, rhythmic sound. Not heavy work boots, leather soles, knuckles rapped briskly against the oak of the front door. 3 sharp knocks. Ruth wiped her hands on her jeans, smearing the grease, and pushed herself up from the floor. Her back screamed in protest. She walked to the door and pulled it open. Standing on the porch was a man in his early 30s. He was wearing a light gray suit that looked too clean for the dusty air. He carried a leather clipboard. He looked at Ruth, his eyes briefly flicking over her stained clothes and messy gray hair, before pasting on a professionally sympathetic smile. "Mrs. Hayes?" he asked. His voice was smooth, practiced. "Yes," Ruth said flatly. "I'm David Vance from First Dakota National. We sent a letter." "I got the letter." Ruth didn't invite him in. She stood in the doorway, blocking the view of the boxed-up living room. The heat radiating off the porch was intense. David shifted his weight. "Right. Well, I'm just here to do a preliminary walkthrough. Make sure the property is secure, check the fixtures, and to remind you that the vacate date is this Friday at 5 p.m. Ruth stared at the knot of his tie. It was blue with tiny white anchors. She found it deeply offensive. "The house is fine," Ruth said. "The plumbing groans and the roof over the back porch needs patching, but it's still standing. You don't need to look at it." "It's just protocol, Mrs. Hayes," David said, his smile tightening slightly at the edges. "The bank needs to assess the asset before it goes to auction. I assure you, I'll be quick." He stepped forward, clearly expecting her to move aside. Ruth held her ground for a second, feeling a sudden, violent urge to push him off the porch, to watch his clean suit hit the dusty planks. But the urge faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the familiar, crushing exhaustion. She stepped back. "Make it quick. Don't step on the boxes." David walked in. He smelled like expensive cologne and air conditioning. He pulled a pen from his pocket and started making check marks on his clipboard as he walked through the hallway. He poked his head into the living room, looking at the stacks of cardboard. Getting a head start. That's good, he murmured, scribbling something down. He walked into the kitchen. He tapped his pen against the Formica counter. He looked at the old dripping faucet. Needs a full update, he said, talking more to himself than to her. Gut the cabinets. Laminate floors. Ruth leaned against the door frame, her arms crossed. He was talking about tearing out the kitchen where Arthur had taught her how to dance, where she had spent 30 years making coffee. He was reducing her life to a checklist of necessary renovations. He moved past her into the den. He stopped. He looked at the cast-iron wood stove. Then he looked down. There was a dark, charred mark on the hardwood floor near the bookshelves. It was from a stray ember that had popped out of the stove 6 months ago, during the blizzard. Fire damage, David said, his voice dropping an octave. He squatted down and poked the charred wood with the tip of his pen. This decreases the valuation significantly. Was this reported? Ruth looked at the burn mark. She remembered the massive biker, Dutch, sitting right there, looking at Arthur's chair. She remembered the heat of the fire pushing back the deadly cold of the storm. It was a blizzard, Ruth said, her voice hard. We needed to stay warm. David stood up, brushing a speck of invisible dust off his knee. Be that as it may, Mrs. Hayes, property damage is a liability. The bank will have to factor the cost of replacing these floorboards into the final assessment. He made another swift check mark on his board. He finished his tour in 10 minutes. He didn't ask her where she was going. He didn't ask if she needed help with the boxes. He just clicked his pen shut and turned to face her in the hallway. All right, Mrs. Hayes, everything seems to be in order, aside from the floor damage. The sheriff's deputies will be here Friday afternoon to finalize the possession. You'll need to turn over all keys at that time. I know how an eviction works, Ruth said. David nodded, his professional smile back in place. Have a good day, Mrs. Hayes. He walked out the front door. Ruth watched him get into his spotless sedan, the tires kicking up a small cloud of dust as he pulled out of the driveway. She closed the door. The house was stiflingly hot. She walked over to the burn mark on the floor. She knelt down, her joints popping, and ran her calloused fingers over the rough, charred wood. It was the only mark those 20 men had left behind. They had come like a storm, filled her house with noise and smell, and vanished with the snow. She pressed her hand flat against the floorboards. She was leaving on Friday. She had rented a single room in a dingy boarding house in town. It smelled like bleach and old cigarettes, but it was all she could afford with her Social Security check. She stood up slowly, grabbing the edge of the bookshelf for support. 4 days left. She needed more tape. Thursday morning, the day before the deadline. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight pressing down on the Dakota plains. The sky was a pale, bleached blue, hazy with dust. Inside the house, the air was stagnant. Ruth was done packing. Everything she owned, everything she was taking with her, fit into 14 cardboard boxes and 2 battered canvas suitcases. The rest, the heavy oak dining table, Arthur's leather armchair, the bad memories, the good memories, was staying. Let the bank deal with it. She was sitting on the front porch in a rusty metal lawn chair. She had a glass of lukewarm tap water in her hand. Condensation dripped down her knuckles. She was waiting. Not for the bank, and not for the sheriff. They weren't due until tomorrow. She was just waiting for time to pass. At 1 p.m., she felt it. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a sensation. A low rhythmic tremor that started in the soles of her worn sneakers and crept up her shins. The water in her glass vibrated, forming tiny, concentric ripples on the surface. She frowned, looking down at the glass. Earthquakes were unheard of in this part of the state. Then came the sound. It was a low, distant thunder rolling across the flatlands. But the sky was cloudless. The sound grew, thickening, deepening into a heavy mechanical roar that seemed to tear the hot air apart. Ruth stood up, her grip tightening on the glass. She looked down the long, dusty ribbon of the county road. On the horizon, where the road met the sky, A massive cloud of dust was rising. It looked like a sandstorm, a dirty brown wall rolling toward her farm. The roar became deafening. It rattled the loose aluminum siding on the house. It shook the floorboards of the porch. It was the sound of 100 angry gods tearing through the atmosphere. From out of the dust cloud, they emerged. Not 20 this time. It was a river of chrome and black leather. They rode in a staggered formation, taking up both lanes of the county road. The sun flared violently off heavy exhaust pipes and polished forks. The noise was absolute, a physical force that vibrated in Ruth's teeth and punched at her chest. She dropped the glass. It shattered on the porch, the lukewarm water splashing over her sneakers. She didn't notice. They kept coming, dozens, then 50s, hundreds. The vanguard of the pack reached the end of her driveway. They didn't pass by. They slowed, their boots dragging on the hot asphalt, engines revving and choking down into heavy aggressive idles. They turned into her driveway. The dust they kicked up blotted out the sun. The smell of hot oil, burning rubber, and exhaust fumes washed over the porch, thick enough to taste. They rode up the dirt driveway, the heavy bikes tearing deep grooves into the baked mud. They parked on the dead grass, on the gravel, completely filling the yard. Still, they kept coming off the main road. The line stretched back as far as Ruth could see. Engines began to cut out one by one, a staggered series of loud, popping backfires that sounded like a war zone. As the noise died down, the sheer scale of the invasion became terrifyingly clear. The front yard was completely covered in motorcycles. Hundreds of massive men in leather cuts were dismounting, pulling off sunglasses, wiping sweat and dust from their faces. The Death Head logo was everywhere, on their backs, on their bikes, tattooed on their forearms. Ruth stood frozen on the porch, staring at the sea of leather and chrome. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, bird-like fluttering. She gripped the wooden railing of the porch, a splinter digging into her palm. The crowd of men parted near the front. A single biker walked through the gap. He was massive, his broad shoulders stretching the leather of his cut. His face was weathered, deeply tanned, with a prominent scar pulling down the corner of his left eye. Garrett. He didn't look frozen and desperate this time. He looked powerful. He walked with a heavy rolling gait, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He reached the bottom of the porch stairs and stopped. He looked up at Ruth. He looked at the 14 cardboard boxes stacked visibly just inside the open front door. He looked at the cracked glass and spilled water by her feet. He took off his sunglasses. His dark eyes locked onto hers. "Hello, Ruth," Garrett said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that carried easily in the sudden, heavy silence of the yard. Ruth couldn't speak. Her throat was completely dry. She just stared at him, then looked out over the hundreds of men standing silently in her yard, watching her. Garrett slowly climbed the 3 wooden steps onto the porch. He towered over her, smelling of road dirt and gasoline. "We heard a rumor," Garrett said, his voice dropping for her ears only. "Heard some suit from the bank thinks he's taking this house." Ruth swallowed hard. She forced her voice to work, though it came out cracked and thin. "It's not a rumor. Eviction is tomorrow at 5. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. He didn't offer pity. He didn't offer a sad smile. His face hardened, the scar twisting as his jaw set. He turned around to face the sea of bikers. He raised one massive arm, his fist clenched in the air. The silence in the yard was absolute. 500 men stood completely still, waiting. "The bank!" Garrett roared, his voice echoing off the dry plains. "Thinks they can take the widow's house." A low, dangerous growl rumbled through the crowd. It wasn't a cheer. It was the sound of a predator spotting prey. Men crossed their arms. Hands dropped to heavy chains hanging from their belts. Garrett turned back to Ruth. "They ain't taking it," he said softly. "Go make some coffee, Ruth. We got work to do." They didn't just stand in the yard. They took the property apart and put it back together. Within an hour, the farmhouse was swarming. The heavy, suffocating silence that had smothered Ruth for months was violently replaced by the sounds of industry. It wasn't the neat, quiet work of professional contractors. It was the blunt, aggressive labor of men who knew how to wrench metal and break things until they functioned. A portable gas generator, hauled in the back of a rusted pickup truck that had followed the convoy, roared to life near the barn. The air filled with the sharp chemical stench of exhaust and PVC primer. A man whose leather cut read Nomads across the bottom rocker walked into Ruth's kitchen. He had a gray beard braided down to his sternum and knuckles that looked like crushed walnuts. He didn't ask permission. He opened the cabinet beneath the sink, took one look at the leaking, calcified pipes, and pulled a heavy iron pipe wrench from his belt. "Pipes are shot, ma'am," he grunted, his voice muffled from under the counter. "Shutting off the main." Ruth stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest. She watched him rip out the plumbing Arthur had tried and failed to patch with duct tape 5 years ago. Outside, a rhythmic, deafening hammering began. She walked to the window. A dozen massive men were on her roof. They had stripped their leather jackets off, revealing heavily tattooed arms and sweat-soaked t-shirts. They were tearing up the rotting shingles with pry bars, tossing the debris carelessly into the dead grass below. Garrett had set up a folding card table on the front porch. He sat behind it like a general, a chewed cigar clamped unlit between his teeth. Men lined up, walking up the steps, dropping things onto the table. It wasn't weapons, it was money. Wads of crumpled 20s, stacks of hundreds wrapped in greasy rubber bands, fistfuls of loose change. It smelled like stale beer, sweat, and gasoline. Garrett was counting it, his thick, scarred fingers moving with surprising dexterity, making hash marks on a yellow legal pad. Ruth walked out onto the porch. The heat was still oppressive, but the dust had settled into a fine, gritty film over everything. "Garrett," she said. Her voice was steady, though her hands were shaking. She shoved them deep into the pockets of her jeans. "What are you doing?" Garrett didn't look up from his legal pad. "Bank says the property is a liability. Says it needs repairs to meet valuation. We're doing the repairs." "And the money?" He finally looked up. His dark eyes caught the harsh afternoon sun. "You think 1,000 angels ride out here just to swing hammers? We put out a call. Every chapter from Reno to Buffalo. You kept 20 of our brothers from freezing to death. We figure your life is worth more than a bank's bottom line." He tossed a thick stack of bills onto the growing mountain of cash. "We're buying the paper, Ruth, paying off the mortgage, in full." Ruth stared at the money. It was dirty. It was wrinkled. It was more cash than she and Arthur had seen in their entire lives combined. It felt obscene sitting there on a folding table that smelled of mildew. "I can't take that," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I won't. I'm not a charity case." Garrett stood up. He walked around the table, his heavy boots loud on the wooden planks. He stopped a foot away from her. The sheer mass of him blocked out the sun. "This ain't charity," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "This is a debt. You don't tell us how to pay our debts, and we don't tell you how to make soup. Now go sit down. You're in the way of the lumber." He turned his back on her and walked toward a flatbed truck pulling into the driveway, loaded with stacks of fresh pine 2x4s and heavy rolls of tar paper. Ruth retreated into the house. The air inside smelled of fresh sawdust and sweat. The boxes she had so carefully packed were being shoved aside by men carrying power tools. She walked into the den. The wood stove sat cold and dark in the corner. Arthur's empty leather chair was covered in a thin layer of plaster dust from the men walking heavily on the floorboards above. She sat down on one of her taped-up cardboard boxes. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. She wanted to cry. The pressure in her chest was immense, a balloon expanding against her ribs. But the tears wouldn't come. Instead, a strange, hysterical bubble of laughter rose in her throat. She was being evicted, and the Hells Angels had decided to renovate her house to stop it. The hammering continued late into the night. They brought in floodlights, powered by the roaring generator, turning the farmyard into a glaring, harsh stadium. They grilled hot dogs on a rusted oil drum cut in half, the smell of charred meat and lighter fluid drifting through the open windows. Ruth didn't sleep. She sat in the dark kitchen, drinking tap water out of a plastic cup, listening to the men outside. They cursed. They laughed. They argued over measurements and building codes with surprising ferocity. They were loud, violent men. But as she watched them work under the glaring floodlights, she realized something. They were the first living things to breathe life into this farm since Arthur died. Friday, 4:45 p.m. The heat hadn't broken. If anything, the air felt tighter, heavy with impending static. The yard was a sprawling encampment of chrome and leather. The roof was finished, stark and black with fresh tar paper and new shingles. The plumbing didn't leak. The broken step on the back porch had been replaced with solid, heavy oak. At 4:50 p.m., a cloud of dust appeared on the county road. The sprawling mass of bikers stopped what they were doing. The clinking of wrenches ceased. The low murmur of hundreds of conversations died out, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Two vehicles pulled up to the end of the dirt driveway. The first was a white county sheriff's cruiser. The second was the spotless silver sedan belonging to David, the man from the bank. They didn't drive onto the property. They parked on the shoulder of the county road, their engines idling. Through the haze of heat and dust, Ruth watched from the front porch. Garrett stood beside her, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He had put his cut back on. The winged death head on his back looked stark and menacing in the afternoon sun. The driver's side door of the cruiser opened. A sheriff's deputy stepped out. He was an older man, heavily built, wearing a tan uniform and a wide-brimmed hat. He took one look at the sea of motorcycles filling the yard, the hundreds of massive men standing in total, terrifying silence, and stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't reach for his gun. He just stood by the open door of his cruiser, his hand resting casually on the roof, and lit a cigarette. The door of the silver sedan opened. David stepped out. He was wearing another crisp suit, this one dark navy. He carried his leather clipboard. He looked at the deputy. He pointed toward the house. The deputy shook his head, exhaled a cloud of smoke, and leaned against his car. He wasn't walking into that yard. David swallowed. Even from 50 yards away, Ruth could see the rigid tension in his shoulders. He looked at the wall of bikers blocking the driveway. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, a barricade of denim, leather, and hard stairs. David started walking. He moved stiffly, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. The bikers didn't move to let him through until he was inches away from them. Then, slowly, silently, they parted, creating a narrow, suffocating corridor for him to walk down. The silence was a weapon. The only sound was the crunch of David's shoes and his own ragged breathing. He looked straight ahead, his knuckles white around his clipboard. He reached the base of the porch steps. His suit jacket was already dark with sweat under the arms. He looked up at Ruth, then at Garrett. The banker's professional, sympathetic mask was gone. He looked like a man who had stepped into a cage with a tiger and realized the door had locked behind him. "Mrs. Hayes," David said. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "It is 5 o'clock. We are here to execute the eviction order." Garrett didn't say a word. He reached down and picked up a heavy, dark green canvas duffel bag sitting by his boots. It smelled strongly of canvas, old oil, and sweat. He dropped it off the porch. It hit the dust inches from David's polished shoes with a heavy, muted thud. The zipper was half open. Stacks of bills spilled out into the dirt. 20s, 50s, hundreds. Some were wrapped in crisp paper bands from a bank. Most were bound in thick, greasy rubber bands. David stared at the dirt. He blinked. "The mortgage balance," Garrett said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried easily over the silent crowd. "Including your late fees, your processing fees, and the penalty for early payoff." It's $84,622. Garrett pointed a thick, scarred finger at the bag. There's 90 grand in there. Count it. David looked from the bag to Garrett's face. We don't accept cash settlements in the field. It has to be processed through the branch, a cashier's check or a wire transfer. Garrett took a slow step down the wooden stairs. The wood groaned under his weight. He stopped on the second step, bringing his face level with David's. The smell of the biker, leather, sweat, and cheap tobacco washed over the banker. You're going to accept it, Garrett said softly. You're going to write a receipt on that little clipboard of yours. You're going to stamp it paid in full, and then you're going to get in your car and drive back to the city. David looked back toward the county road. The deputy was still leaning against his cruiser, smoking. The deputy offered a small, useless shrug. David looked at the 500 men surrounding him, men who lived outside the lines of the polite, bureaucratic world he understood, men who could bury him under the floorboards of this farmhouse, and no one would ever find him. His hands were visibly shaking as he knelt in the dust. He didn't count the money. He just zipped the heavy canvas bag shut, the brass teeth catching on a stray $20 bill. He dragged it up by the heavy canvas straps. He rested his clipboard on his knee, his pen trembling violently as he filled out a form. He ripped the yellow carbon copy off the pad and handed it up to Garrett. Garrett took it. He read it. He nodded. Have a safe drive back, Garrett said. David didn't reply. He turned around carrying the heavy duffel bag and walked back down the narrow corridor of silent men. He shoved the bag into the trunk of his sedan, slammed it shut, and got into the driver's seat. He threw the car into reverse, kicking up a massive cloud of gravel, and sped down the county road. The deputy tossed his cigarette butt onto the asphalt, ground it out with his heel, and got back into his cruiser. He followed the sedan, his taillights disappearing into the dust. The silence held for 3 more seconds. Then the yard erupted. 500 men roared. It was a chaotic, deafening sound of triumph. Fists punched the air. Boots stomped the ground. It was a primal, violent noise that shook the windows of the farmhouse. Ruth stood on the porch, the yellow receipt fluttering in Garrett's massive hand. She closed her eyes. The tight, crushing band around her chest, the band that had been there since July, suddenly snapped. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The air tasted like dust and exhaust. It tasted like life. The departure took over an hour. Engines roared to life, a rolling thunder that vibrated deep in the earth. The men didn't form up in a neat line. They left in chaotic bursts, peeling out of the driveway, kicking up clods of dirt, and leaving deep black rubber marks on the asphalt of the county road. They didn't say goodbye to Ruth. They just nodded as they rode past the porch, a silent acknowledgement of a debt paid and a ledger cleared. Garrett was the last to leave. He stood by his heavy customized Harley, pulling on his thick leather gloves. He looked at the house. The new roof gleamed black in the fading evening light. The porch no longer sagged. He walked back up to the porch, his boots heavy on the wood. He held out the yellow carbon copy of the receipt. Ruth took it. The paper was thin, flimsy, smudged with dirt and the oil from Garrett's fingers, but the words "paid in full" were written clearly in black ink. Keep it safe, Garrett said. Bankers have bad memories. Ruth looked at the paper, then at the massive biker, the scar on his face, the tattoos, the rough leather. He looked like the kind of man you cross the street to avoid. He was the man who had just saved her life. Why? Ruth asked. The word was rough, scraping against her throat. $90,000. All this work. Just for some soup and a warm fire? Garrett adjusted his grip on his gloves. He looked out over the empty, rutted yard. It wasn't the soup, Ruth, he said quietly. It was the chair. Ruth frowned, confused. Arthur's chair? When Dutch went to sit in it, Garrett said, turning his dark eyes back to her. You stopped him. You were a 60-year-old woman trapped in a room with 20 freezing animals, and you stood your ground to protect a ghost. You demanded respect when you had no power to enforce it. He paused, the corner of his mouth twitching into a slight, grim smile. We understand that, Garrett said. We respect that. You protected what was yours. We just returned the favor. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned, walked down the steps, and swung a heavy leg over his motorcycle. He kicked the starter, the engine exploding into a deafening, rhythmic idle. He kicked it into gear and rolled down the driveway, joining the fading trail of dust on the horizon. Ruth stood alone on the porch. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the Dakota plains. The roaring of the engines faded, replaced by the familiar, endless sigh of the wind sweeping through the dried corn stalks. The silence returned, but it was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. It wasn't the sound of a house waiting to be empty. It was just quiet. Ruth walked inside. The house smelled faintly of sawdust, new paint, and stale coffee. She walked past the taped-up cardboard boxes in the living room. She would have to unpack them tomorrow. The thought didn't fill her with exhaustion. It just felt like a chore, a normal, mundane chore. She walked into the kitchen. She turned on the faucet. The water pressure was strong. The pump didn't groan. The pipes didn't rattle. Clear, cold water poured into the stainless steel sink in a steady stream. She turned it off. She walked into the den. The room was dark, shadowed. Arthur's leather armchair sat in the corner, empty. She walked over to it and ran her hand along the worn armrest. She could still smell his old spice if she leaned in close enough. For the first time in 10 months, the smell didn't make her want to collapse. It just made her sad. A normal, manageable sadness. She walked out of the den, leaving the chair empty. She had a house to put back together, and she needed to find a sharp knife to cut the packing tape. If this story made you feel the raw power of respect and unexpected loyalty, hit that like button right now. It tells us we're bringing you the stories that matter. Drop a comment below. What do you think about Garrett's reason for saving the house? Did Ruth do the right thing by standing her ground? Share this video with friends who love a gritty, real-life story where the underdogs win, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on the next unforgettable narrative. We'll see you in the next one.